Hello, welcome to this EGU webinar on how to write a policy brief. My name is Simon Clark. I am EGU's projects manager here at the Executive Office, and I will be moderating this session today. If you have any questions during this webinar, please enter them at the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. There you can also upvote other people's questions if you want them to be answered, and all questions will be answered towards the end of this webinar. So after our presenter has spoken. About that, our speaker today is Chloe Hill, EGU's policy manager, who undertakes activities to enhance the connection between policymakers and scientists, and through a coordination of resources and activities that provide policymakers with scientific information. Today, she'll be discussing how to outline how researchers can write an effective policy brief and disseminate it so it has a policy impact. So with that, can you start, Chloe?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Simon. And thanks to everyone who's joining us here today. So as Simon mentioned, the presentation today will actually focus on how to write a policy brief, but I'll be outlining a few other details about engaging with policymaking more generally. The presentation should go for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So as Simon mentioned, please do put your questions into the chat and we'll get to as many of them as possible. Before we really dive into it today, just a little bit of background on science or policy and why it's important for researchers to engage in the policymaking process. Now, if you're already in this Zoom room or if you're watching this online, you're at least somewhat interested already. But I think this quote by Sir Peter Gluckman really sums it up. So in a world facing increasingly complex challenges, the role of evidence and scientific advice in policymaking has never been more critical. And I think this is really true. And we are seeing, particularly in Europe, where EGU is based, policymakers in Europe are demanding more scientific evidence to help them with their policymaking, to make sure the legislation they are creating is informed by evidence. And we're also seeing more and more researchers and scientific institutions want to engage in this process as well, which I think is really positive. It's very much needed, and there is demand from both sides, which is really great. Now, when we're looking at this slide, we're looking at the types of motivations or reasons why researchers and those who are adjacent to researchers might want to engage in the policymaking process. So this includes myself. As the EGU's policy manager, I see myself as a knowledge broker, so someone who works between scientists and policymakers, helping researchers provide evidence. That means I also write some policy briefs myself. But one of my main motivations for doing this is to help guide effective policymaking and to improve policy outcomes. So this is overall beneficial for society, and all legislations that we have should at least be informed by scientific evidence. Another reason why you might want to start engaging in policymaking, or why you might want to write a policy brief, is to increase the impact of your own research. A lot of the time when we do engage with research, when we're writing various articles, we're motivated to have an impact. And there's lots of different ways as researchers that you can do that. If you're publishing in a scientific journal, that's having impact on your own research community, who might then cite that article that you're publishing. You might also do outreach on social media platforms, or by writing blog posts, or maybe you go into schools and talk to children and get them really interested in science. And all of these things are ways that you can have impact with your research. But another way is by engaging with policymaking and supporting that process. So it's another really good reason to start writing policy briefs, which we'll talk about in a few slides' time. Another reason is to help mitigate risks and uncertainties. And the last reason I have on the screen is to expand your professional network and to create new opportunities for yourself. So as a researcher, you will go to events where there are other researchers. You might be part of different consortia, and you're probably very good at networking with other people who are doing similar scientific research to yourself. But by expanding this network and including people who are non-scientists, you actually create different opportunities that can further your career in other areas. So it can be very beneficial for that reason too. Now, when we're thinking about engaging with policymaking, if you haven't started doing this, you might not be sure what it looks like. And there are actually lots of different ways in which scientists can engage with policymaking, and that when we're writing a policy brief, we might be writing it for different reasons. So I think this is important to keep in mind before you even start writing a policy brief, to really identify the purpose of that policy brief. One reason might be to identify issues that actually need policy action, so things that aren't being addressed yet by policymakers. A good example of this was climate change a few decades ago. So back then, it wasn't being addressed at all by policymakers. There wasn't any legislation on climate change until scientists showed that it was an issue and that we did need legislation on it to help try to mitigate it. And now, of course, we do have climate targets and we do have different climate policies as well. Another reason why you might like to write a policy brief is to provide explanations and examples of complex systems that allow policymakers to understand intended and unintended consequences of the policies they're creating. So to really further explain what a policy decision might result in. The next reason is to find solutions to specific issues during implementation. So once a policy or a legislation is created, it needs to be implemented. And in the EU, the policy implementation actually happens on a member level state. So each individual member state or country has to implement a policy, and to do this, they need to contextualize it to their own national circumstances. And for this, they will need scientific evidence. So if you are writing a policy brief, it's also important to think about what level of governance you are targeting. Now, sorry, that was the doorbell. I'm not going to answer it, so it might ring again. Another reason why we might write a policy brief is to help evaluate the impact and effect of a potential policy. Again, in the EU, legislations are evaluated on a regular basis, usually every 5 years, to see if they're effective. And the last reason you might like to write a policy brief or engage in policymaking is to help policymakers respond to a crisis. Now, this can obviously be very challenging because policymakers need the information very quickly. But if you're already working on a policy brief, maybe you need to tweak it a little bit so that you can publish it and disseminate to policymakers in time. Now, before we dive into really what a policy brief looks like, I just wanted to highlight there is different ways in which we can contribute to scientific advice mechanisms. There are formal pathways and informal pathways. Now, formal pathways are things like European Commission consultations. These are calls for evidence that are institutionalized within the different policy institutions. The Commission has them, the Parliament has them, EU member state and national governments also have them. So this is a solicited call for evidence, essentially. There are also informal ways of engaging with policymakers too. So these are things like if you want to get in touch with a policymaker because you really think they need to know something, maybe you published research recently that you think is very relevant to a particular policy issue they're working on. You can email them, you can call them, you can engage with them and ask for a meeting, and you can write a policy brief to share that with them. Now, ideally, these two things aren't done separately. You can actually do them together. So you can engage informally by writing a policy brief and by requesting a meeting with a policymaker. And then that might turn into a more solicited invitation later on. Or vice versa, you might start by giving some solicited information that the policymaker then thinks is really useful, and they come back to you and have a more informal discussion about it later on. So both of these forms are very valid and they should be used. Okay, and now when we're actually looking at who makes policy briefs versus who uses policy briefs, I quite like breaking it down in this way. I think most people on the webinar today, or if you listen to this online, you'll be able to identify which role you play most often. Now, these roles are definitely a spectrum. So you might, play one particular role in one capacity and also play a different role in a different capacity, and that's totally fine. But I think it helps us identify if we're going to be writing the policy brief, or if we're going to be helping to disseminate it, or if we're going to be reading the policy brief. So the first one here is researchers, and I would assume that is most people in the call today. They are people who contribute to creating and gathering evidence. We then have knowledge brokers who facilitate the transfer of knowledge. And again, this is where I would put myself. So I'm not a researcher myself. I don't do the research, but I support researchers who gather the evidence in transferring that evidence and that knowledge to policymakers. Science advisors play a similar role, but a more specific role because they provide relevant and contextualized information to policymakers. They really engage very specifically in this dissemination, and I would say are the people who really actually write the policy briefs or finalize the policy briefs and then really focus on disseminating them. So if you are a researcher, it's really great if you can work with a science advisor in this capacity. And the next three are people who actually use policy briefs. So it's practitioners. These are people who implement and do things on the ground. They aren't necessarily policymakers, although they might be, but they also might be people working in industry or working for various think tanks and things like that. There are policy advisors, and these are the people who support the decision makers. They are the people who you probably most want to contact if you're trying to disseminate a policy brief. They might actually restructure the policy brief themselves, so they might have a bit of a hand in creating policy briefs as well, but they might restructure them and make them even more relevant for the decision maker at the end of the day. And the final person I have on the list here is obviously the person who reads the policy brief, who uses the policy brief, and that is the policymaker who considers the evidence and makes the decision. So this is just things that are useful to keep in mind. Now, diving into policy briefs. What is a policy brief? It is a concise summary of a specific issue. It provides policy options or recommendations that the policymaker can use to deal with this issue. It targets or aims to give government policymakers and other stakeholders involved in formulating and influencing policy. So you're really targeting a very specific audience, and it can take different formats. So as we go through the rest of the presentation today, I'll be showing you a few different types of policy briefs. This one here is one that is actually made by the European Commission. So you can see it's a very specific outline. They have the headlines, the background, they have a nice image there. And we'll be going into more of what this looks like in a few slides' time, but we will be focusing on some specific examples. Now, before you get to this point in time, there are some things you should consider before you start to write a policy brief. So firstly, understanding what the current and upcoming policies are is very important. This will help you frame your policy brief to make sure it is relevant for the policy community that you are targeting. If you have research that you're currently working on and you think it's relevant, it is firstly a really good idea to have a look at the political landscape and have a look at some of the political issues and try to link your research with those issues just to make sure it's relevant for policymakers, that they're going to want to read it. Once you've done this, selecting your target audience can be very useful. This allows you to, again, further frame your policy brief, understanding exactly which areas are relevant and why they're relevant for specific people. You then can decide on your overarching message. Policy briefs are concise. So they're 2, maybe 3 or 4 pages long at a maximum. And so you really have to have 1, maybe 2 or 3 key main messages you want the policymaker or person reading this policy brief to take away. You then have to choose a point of entry to make sure your readers are interested. Again, if you're a policymaker, a decision maker, a policy advisor, anyone in this kind of position, you are very, very short on time. So they may or may not read the entire policy brief. Now, they are more likely to read it if you can get them interested in at the very start. If you can tell them why it is relevant to them, you understand their motivation because you understand your target audience, you understand the upcoming policies and legislations, and you can tell them that straight up, they are more likely to read the whole thing. Outlining key policy options is also really important. So one of the main mistakes that researchers make when they are trying to engage in policymaking is that they only focus on the challenges. They only focus on the issues and don't focus enough on the solutions. Now, outlining the issues or the policy problems is something that scientists do need to do. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, there is a time and a place for that. However, most of the time, policymakers are looking for solutions. And if your policy brief doesn't outline any potential solutions or options for them, they won't find it useful. And so maybe you need to step outside of your own, research to find these potential policy options, work with other experts, work with other researchers, but also work with people outside of academia as well to put these policy options or policy solutions together. That is really useful. And the last thing you should do before you even start writing a policy brief is think about how you would like to disseminate it. It might seem a bit early to do this, but the earlier you start thinking about how you would like to share your policy brief with your target audience, the better it will be. Because there is no point writing a policy brief if no one sees it. So understanding the policy question. This is, again, going to help your policy brief have more of a policy impact because it will, if you understand the policy question, give you the ability to address the already identified issues policymakers are facing. It will make it a lot more interesting for policymakers. It will make them want to read the whole policy brief that you're creating. However, understanding the policy questions or the policy issues and the political landscape can be really challenging. So how do we do this as researchers? The first thing is to get involved early. Before you start writing a policy brief, start to understand, again, who might want to read this policy brief, understand which departments or in, the commission, which DGs it might be relevant for, and who you might like to disseminate it to. And you can do this by attending various policy events. So obviously most scientists attend conferences and scientific events, but you can also start to attend policy events that not only target policymakers, but also have policymakers as speakers. If you attend these events, if you're able to in person, it's fantastic, otherwise online. Not only can you listen to the speakers and get a better feel for the different types of topics they're talking about or the issues that are coming up for them, but you can also talk to people in the coffee break or at the networking reception and really form those connections and hopefully get more informal information that can help you really understand the problem. If you're attending events online, this can be more challenging to really network in that capacity. However, you might like to reach out to someone after the event is over and see if they'd like to have a Zoom call or something like that. Now, if you read and answer EU Commission consultations, this can also help you understand the political landscape. You can find these EU Commission consultations by typing in have your say EU and it will come up. And basically these EU Commission consultations are the start of the legislative process. This is the Commission. The Commission is the legislative body that actually proposes legislation. So this is the first people to really come up, write the legislation that then goes to Parliament and the Council later on. But they will always publish things to get feedback, not only from scientists, but also from the European community more generally. And once you see something that is published, it is likely to become a legislation in a few years' time. So this is something that the Commission will be working on, and later the Council and the Parliament will be working on too. So if you want to go through and you can type in like different keywords and things like that, just to search specific issues, but it can be a very useful tool. Now, choosing your audience, once you sort of understand what the political issue is and you understand the political landscape, choosing your audience can be a challenge. And something I often recommend is to do a stakeholder mapping. You can see this in the picture. This is some stakeholder mapping that I've done. It's a little bit messy and I'm not the best stakeholder mapper ever, but I think even if you are doing it as a beginner, it can be really useful. It identifies who else is working on this issue, the other stakeholders that are involved. So not just policymakers, that maybe there are think tanks involved, NGOs, industry, and it also helps you identify where you might align on certain issues. and who you might like to contact as you're writing the policy brief to get different perspectives. Because the more perspective your policy brief has, the stronger it will be. If you give a policymaker a policy brief that is just from you or from your institution, it can be really useful. But if it's from your institution as well as another sector or a few different institutions, then the policymaker sees that there is some consensus around this particular issue and they might be more likely to pay attention to it. So these stakeholder mappings can be time consuming, but they don't necessarily have to be. You can find a lot of resources online on YouTube about how to do these stakeholder mappings. You can spend a couple of hours on it and then, not look at it again for a week and then come back to it once you find some more stakeholders to add as well. So it's not something you have to do all in one go. Now, I've talked a little bit about policy options a few slides ago. I just want to really clarify what I mean by policy options versus policy recommendations. Again, policymakers really like to see potential solutions in a policy brief if possible. You don't have to have just one solution though. So what I often encourage people to do is to outline several different options that the policymaker can take and the consequences of these options. Again, if we're going back to a climate change example, you might say, look, if you set a target of reducing emissions by 50%, these are the likely outcomes of that, the economic implications of that, but also, the future scenarios. If you reduce or want to mitigate climate change by 80%, this is likely the outcomes of that. So you lay out the options for the policymaker and leave the decision making up to them, because as a policymaker or a decision maker, that is their job. Now, in specific scenarios where you do need to give very specific advice, recommendations might be a better fit. And when you're writing a policy brief and you're giving recommendations, this is the one course that you believe is the right one, or that you would like to see in the legislation. Generally speaking, I like to steer away from this because I think that scientists should try to be honest brokers and provide a range of options, and the decision makers should do their job and make the decisions. But in some cases, like the EU Nature Restoration Law, which you can see our document here, which is similar to a policy brief, we did give some quite specific recommendations. And that is because it was towards the end of the legislative cycle. The legislation was already proposed by the Commission, and the Parliament were in the phase of amending or editing this legislation to make it better, hopefully, or make it worse, as was the case. And so we were giving recommendations about how they could change the legislative wording to make it, in our opinion, stronger and more based on the scientific evidence. And so there we gave some very specific recommendations rather than policy options. So again, you can do either, and it is a case-based decision at the end of the day. So here is the recipe for a policy brief. Number one is a catchy title. Now, it's really important to be able to communicate the content of the policy brief in a way that's accurate, but also in a way that's memorable. So you don't want a title that is too long and too wordy. You want it to be punchy, and you want it to really emphasize what that policy brief is about. This can be harder than it sounds. You want an overview to start with. You want to outline the key, most important points up front in like an executive summary. Now, policy briefs, again, should be 2 to 4 pages, but having a really short summary of even that can be really useful. So using bullet lists are great. But this, again, allows the policymaker or person reading it to understand why it might be useful for them to continue reading. You can then give some background and explain why the topic is important. Any additional context, so outline the cause of the issue and its current relevance. Potentially, you also would like to highlight what legislations or what policies this policy brief is relevant for, so that the policymaker knows that up front as well. You can then outline the approaches and findings, and then you would outline the policy options or recommendations. So this needs to be clear statements with concrete advice. It shouldn't be too long. Again, you have to fit all of this within maximum of 4 pages, basically, which again can be quite complicated, but what you should be aiming to do. And then you can outline some sources. So maybe you want to link to a website that has a list of the different sources you used, or maybe you want to link to a website that actually provides a longer, some more detailed information. A QR code can be good for this as well. And finally, if you add your contact details and even a photo of yourself, that can be useful as well to show that you're approachable. It allows the policymaker or person reading your policy brief to reach out to you for more information. So again, here's one example, and this is an Austrian example. It is in English though, so hopefully everyone here can read it. This highlights some of the things that I just talked about. So firstly, you have the top here on the left-hand side, a catchy title, not too long, very self-explanatory about what this 2-page policy brief is about. You then have a section that's bullet points that sort of outlines what the next 2 pages will be about and highlights the most important things. You have, the background or what it's about, the key results, and then a section on what to do. So this is where they put their policy options or recommendations. You then have a further reading list. So again, a link to more information and a contact. There's also a picture they've added here. Now, pictures can be really great if they are, attractive and they are relevant. Graphs can also be very good if they're easy enough to read. This particular picture and this particular graph, I'm undecided on. I actually don't think that, this picture is fine, I guess. I think it could be a little better. It's not particularly depictive and, it's a bit bland. And the graph is okay, but you want to make sure the graph that you're using can be understood by a non-scientist. So that's the most important thing if you do want to include a graph in your policy brief. So here are just some additional tips before we get into the questions. So the first is to keep it simple with short sentences and paragraphs. Something is much more attractive to read if there are dot points, if you break up the text into paragraphs and also into sections like we saw in the previous example of a policy brief. And if you keep things short, it's easy to read, make it easier. That's the number 1 tip. 2 is to give it an appealing and reader-friendly layout. Now, I am not the best designer myself. At the EGU office, we actually have a head of communications who is very, very good at designing various things such as policy briefs. She designs all of ours. And I would say play to your strengths. So if you're working on a policy brief, the best thing is to not do it alone, is to do it with your team or again, maybe with your wider network. And not only because you have different areas or scientific disciplines that you are researching and that you can contribute, but also because you have different skills and different strengths in that regard. Maybe you have one person who is very, very good at summarizing in your team, and you have another person who is very good at design, and then you could divide and conquer, basically. Avoid jargon and avoid acronyms. I try not to use any acronyms where possible. If I have to use an acronym, I use one. In the entire policy brief, we use one acronym. Quite often that acronym is EGU. So really try to spell things out, because even if you've made it obvious what those letters stand for at the beginning, by the time someone gets to the end, they're still having to do extra work to translate it into the full 3 words or 4 words or however long the acronym is. Of course, jargon, when we're communicating with a non-scientific audience, is always good to try and limit. As a researcher, you might not be aware of what is and isn't jargon, so it's a really good idea to get someone to read through who is a non-expert or a non-academic and ask them if they understand everything. And that way you can also highlight where areas are maybe a bit too jargony. The next thing is to be clear about how the issue you're addressing relates to policy or relates to a specific piece of legislation, particularly a piece of legislation that your target audience is working on. You should also, and this is a little bit different from most writing, but also start each paragraph with the most important information. Again, you want the person reading this document to get to the end of the paragraph. The best way of doing that is making them aware of how important that paragraph is. So putting the most important information up front. Again, using eye-catching photos and graphs that are relevant to the information you're presenting. This again can be challenging. Maybe you have someone in your team who's great at creating visuals. If so, make sure you use them. And you should be upfront about any uncertainty. Uncertainty can be a really challenging topic when we're talking, just generally speaking, when we're researching. It's also a difficult topic for policymakers. When they're making decisions, they don't particularly like having uncertainty, but there is normally uncertainty involved, and the policymakers are aware of that. So making them aware of the specific uncertainties, not going into a huge amount of detail, but saying it up front, can help build that trust, which is also really important. And I've already mentioned to get a non-scientist to read through it. So this is the final slide, and it's on dissemination. And again, I would say this is the most important part of a policy brief, because a policy brief doesn't share itself, and there's no point writing a policy brief if no one sees it. So you must actively seek out your audience. So find the right people to share it with. Again, this is where your stakeholder mapping can come in and be very useful. Also, obviously, make sure you send it ideally personalized emails to your target audience. Again, your stakeholder mapping is useful there, but you can also publish it more widely. So on your institute's website, so that other people can find it. You can publish it in newsletters. You can write a blog post on it and share it that way. You can share it on social media and things like that. But really targeting your audience is the most important thing, because they're the people that you want to see it. Once you do target your audience with a personalized email, you can request a meeting to share the key information and answer any follow-up questions. Policymakers do have face-to-face meetings with people for this reason. Even if it's just a phone call with their assistant, that can be really useful. If you want to share it, if you have more time and you want it to be really thorough when you're sharing it, you can host an event or a webinar that is relevant for the policy brief and actually invite your target audience as a speaker. So you have a panel to discuss a particular issue, tell them the whole webinar or the whole event that you are hosting is focusing on the outcomes of this policy brief. They then have to read the policy brief and they have to be able to speak on it. So it's a really great way of getting them firstly involved by inviting them to your event, but also making sure they've read this particular policy brief. This is something that EGU did very effectively with our policy brief on the EU nature restoration law. We invited some of the key members of the European Parliament to the event, and they did read out our policy brief, and they then also after the event asked some follow-up questions. So it can be a very effective method, but it obviously does require more time and sometimes also some finances if you're hosting it in person. Again, if you have a network, so not just within your institution, but also a wider network, both in academia and outside of academia, you can send it to them and ask them to share it. You can do the same thing for them. Say, look, if you ever have something you want to share to a broader audience, we can also share it. But it can be a nice way of reaching people who you wouldn't be able to reach otherwise. And of course, there's the social media, news items, all of those different things. So that is it for the presentation. I can see we've got some questions.
Yes, thank you, Chloe. We'll go into some questions now. But to begin with, I want to ask, so a lot of scientists, for example, might not have experience in science or policy work, might not sure where to begin. So how to get started if you want to contribute to our policy brief?
Absolutely. So again, the best way of writing a policy brief is by doing it in a team. And as an individual researcher, of course, you can summarize your own research, but the most useful policy brief it provides a good overview of the general scientific consensus and considers multiple scientific disciplines. And so if you haven't already, find a team to work with. It might be within your own institute, but it might also be within a broader network of scientists to work on certain issues and to publish policy briefs like the ones we saw, the examples we saw, when you think it's a good time to do so, when there's a policy window, as we say. Within the EGU, we also give our researchers the opportunity to do this. So at the moment, we have the EGU Biodiversity Task Force, and they, as 8 experts, have written the most of our policy briefs, with the help of the EGU office. and we've helped them to disseminate those policy briefs. EGU will be starting a new task force in 2025 on climate hazards, and we'll be doing similar work with them. So if you want to be part of this task force, we will have an open call in early 2025, and you'll then work with me and I will help you, guide you through that process initially. And yeah, we'll basically do it together.
Sure, just to quickly build off that. So I guess part of it is to kind of find or build your network. And do you have advice to do that? And one final question before we go to the audience questions is, you mentioned there's a timeliness to responding to the policymaking process. When is the best time to, I guess, put forward a policy brief in a process? So how to build a network or find people, and when is the best way to send or publish your policy brief?
Yeah, so finding a network can be time consuming, but it is something you can start doing right away, which is always nice. I would say by coming, one way you can do it is every Monday, the EGU has a science and policy hangout where people who are interested in doing this kind of work come, we meet each other, we chat about various science and policy issues, and it is always on the first Monday of every month at 2 o'clock. Except for this Monday, which is the first Monday of November, because EG will be hosting an online and in-person science and policy event on climate hazards. You are also welcome to come to this event. Maybe Simon can put the link to the online event, or I can do that, put that into the chat. And basically, if you want to come to this event, it will be a great online networking opportunity because we will have breakout rooms and discuss the various issues. There will be academics there and scientists there, but there will also be policymakers there as well. Yeah, so you are welcome to join that. Outside of that, going to events is any event and just talking to people is a great way of doing it. Trying to find various, task forces, things you can apply to join, or more open groups, various working groups. Also, often have open calls for new members. You can search those online based on your interests. You can also, socialize online. I don't know if Twitter's much of a good networking place at the moment, but places like LinkedIn can be really useful.
Yeah, and so the follow-up question was also, responding in part to a audience question is, when is the best time to kind of publish a policy brief?
Yes.
And also, what is a policy window?
Yeah, sorry, I forgot that part of the question. So a policy window is your opportunity to act, essentially. It's when the policymakers need that specific piece of information. And this policy window, it can open, for example, when the Commission first publishes an open call for a consultation. Usually they leave 6 weeks open for you to give feedback. And once you start doing this and you create, a little form and answer their questions, you can then follow that on. So the best time to answer a Commission consultation is when it's open. But after it's been open, generally speaking, that consultation will then turn into a legislative proposal. And that legislative proposal will then go through another phase, and that is another consultation. So you then can provide feedback on the written proposal of that particular legislation. Once that legislation has been proposed officially, it will go to the Parliament, and then there'll be another window of opportunity to engage with the Parliament on this issue and encourage them to amend this legislation in certain ways. So the great thing about engaging with policy is you don't just do it once. You can do a lot of work to really understand one political issue, and then follow that political issue or that piece of legislation for a couple of years and keep sort of chipping away, understanding who is working on it at that current time in the EU context, whether that be the Commission or the Parliament or the Council, and then the EU member states. But you can have a really solid idea and understanding of that legislation and continue to engage with it. And timing can be tricky. So sometimes if you come across the legislation too late, you will run out of time to engage with it. So it might happen that it's already been proposed by a piece of legislation, it's been proposed by the Commission, and the Parliament is now dealing with it. However, it might take you more time to be able to provide those members of the Parliament with information. Maybe they're contacting you because they want some scientific information about this, but because you haven't already engaged with it, you have to do a lot more research into the political landscape and understanding the actual legislation. and you miss the chance because the vote in the parliament has already happened. And that's a shame, but I think you have to be, you know, once you've done it once, you can do it a bit quicker. And the earlier you start engaging with a piece of legislation before it's even been proposed, the better.
Sure. So the common intention of science is slow, policy is quick, but in order to respond to these consultations, it's good to have a good foundation beforehand, whether that's network or otherwise other communication material. Yeah. And
Absolutely.
to find these public consultations, that's on the European Commission website, right?
Yeah,
How do you
it's
say?
I can actually, I'll find the link to it, but you can also easily Google it, have your say EU, and it will come up.
I think I have it right here, actually. I'll just put it in the chat
Yeah.
now. And building on that, there's a couple of questions as well about examples of policy briefs. Speaking of on resources, do you know where we could perhaps find good examples of policy briefs? So what people could
Yes.
perhaps
So
copy
again,
there.
the EGU Biodiversity Task Force published some sort of longer form ones, but I would still say they classify as policy briefs. You can find them on the EGU Biodiversity page. There's like a list of the ones they published. So that is one example of the ones that the EGU have done, and we very specifically targeted the EU Nature Restoration Law. So all the policy briefs that the group did were targeting the nature restoration law. I will say we only really started to engage with it at the very end of the commission stage. So when it was being proposed is when we started to engage with it. And we did primarily work with the parliament. So it was the end stage of the legislation, and that still lasted 1.5 years. And even here, because we're following the legislation, we understand, again, going back to the timing of it, we understood the various complications and the issues with the legislation, or the issues that the policymakers saw. For example, one of those issues was with peatlands. The nature restoration law, it did pass, but it was very, very close to not passing. A lot of people in the parliament didn't think it would. And we didn't foresee that as an issue when we first went into it. But one of the issues was with peatlands, because peatlands do need to be restored, but a lot of them are on agricultural land. And this was an issue for a lot of farmers who have quite a big lobby and interact with the parliament a lot. And so initially the parliament wanted to take peatlands out of this legislation completely. So they wanted to pass the legislation, but they didn't want peatlands to be restored. And so we focused, you know, one of our policy briefs on the importance of restoring peatlands. We had to make sure, you know, we targeted the members of the European Parliament who'd be voting and target them in different ways. So obviously some members of the European Parliament were very for restoring peatlands. And in this case, we were trying to give them more ammunition so that they could actually present this in Parliament and maybe talk to other members, some of their colleagues, to also get them to vote. And if we were targeting members of the parliament who were likely to vote against the legislation, we would sort of more try and encourage them to abstain, essentially, or like, you know, in a way that it is a very delicate process, because obviously we're providing science advice. We aren't actually trying to advocate for a particular outcome. So in our wording, we were always very, we really emphasize the fact that this is what the evidence says about this particular issue. And we tried not to be presenting it in a way that advocated for one option over another.
Sure, thanks for answering the question. Just a slightly different one now. We've mostly been talking about EU level policy briefs, I guess. Have you got any insight on perhaps how to, I suppose, do that at a national level at all?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of really great examples actually on a national level too. Post in the UK, I don't know, some of you want to find that as well. They do some really great policy briefs as well. And they essentially, provide science. They're an organisation dedicated to providing science advice to the Parliament in the UK. On the Austrian, I did provide one Austrian example from ITA. They are also doing a lot of really great policy briefs as well. You will notice there are different styles. So the post policy brief, the UK version, is very different from the ITA version in Austria. Different institutions follow different formats. Another one you might like to look at is the STOA policy briefs, and that again is more of an EU level. But national governments need policy briefs, local governments need policy briefs. EU government needs policy briefs. Everyone needs them. So when you are deciding to engage, it is important to decide what level of governance you're most interested in engaging with. Because you can't do everything. You can't understand all forms and levels of governance. It's just too much work and there's too much going on, and you can't know that many people. So you really should focus on one level, at least to start with. And obviously the EGU does EU level. And that is because we're a European organization, but it's also because in the office and myself, I speak English. And so being able to communicate in English for me is really important. However, if you're working on a member state level or a national level and you want to speak your own mother tongue, that's a really good reason to work on a national level or on a local level. If you want to be able to interact with the people, which is also, as I mentioned, can be hugely beneficial. It's really great to engage on a local level because you can actually just go have a coffee with someone. And maybe you can do this on a national level too, if you're willing to, if you live in the capital city or if you're willing to travel a little way. But yeah, the conversations you can have on a mother tongue level can be really powerful.
Yeah, so basically choose your level. I think we focus on EU, but especially local level can be very powerful, I think. And also try and find examples from that level. So for example, in UK perspective, they have the Office for Science and Technology. They do the briefs, so you might look for that, look for equivalent in your own host country, for example, to go from that. Speaking of communications, do you have any idea about how to kind of reduce or simplify large or complex information? I think this is perhaps a science communication problem, but if you've got any more further advice about that, I think that'll be really useful.
It can be really challenging. Again, I would say the best thing you can do is really try to contextualize whatever you're trying to communicate to a very specific audience. So if you're trying to, I mean, there's a lot of really big topics out there, and I can say like biodiversity in the nature restoration law was a huge topic. There were so many different areas that we could have focused on. But again, we tried to keep the policy brief as concise as possible. So what we did was try to find a few issues within that piece of legislation that we knew were really key deciding factors for the policymakers. And again, for one of them was forest ecosystems and how they should be restored, and one of them was peatlands. And so instead of focusing on the entire nature restoration law, we focused on that section of it. And really tried to give more detailed information about that and more clearer recommendations about if that was to be included in the legislation, how it could be included in an evidence-based way. And so I think if you can redefine the challenge or the issue you're working on to have a slightly narrower scope, that can be really useful. It's a challenging thing to do. The other thing I would say is it really helps to have someone in your team who is good at summarizing. When we wrote a lot of our policy briefs, we would write them together in a Google document, and then they would be 36 pages long, which is ridiculous, right? It's a lot of information. But then it was my job to be ruthless and heartless and just cut out whole paragraphs, cut out sentences, cut out words. It took me quite a while to do, and I didn't enjoy doing it, but you do need someone who is able to go through and say, this is a really interesting paragraph for something else, but we don't need it here. And so, yeah, and what helped for me was we actually kept the original document, and I would like to write some blog posts based on the information in that document at some point in time. So knowing that information that everyone works so hard to put together isn't lost forever. But for this particular instance, just being ruthless and saying it's not relevant enough, cutting it down.
Sure. So really it's part of making sure you have an effective team, that people are delegated to reducing this information. Perhaps people who have a science communication background, get those involved. And also perhaps reframing the target, like what's the overarching idea? Maybe you can reframe on that to cut out some of the extra information. Okay. So just building on that a bit. Actually, I want to quickly sidestep to a different subject. I've got a couple of questions. One is about having legitimacy as a researcher. If you're approaching a decision maker or policymaking process, either through a policy brief or even individually, how do you make sure you're seen as legitimate or perhaps an authority in your area? How do you make sure that these people will take you seriously?
So I think the best thing you can do is approach either from an institutional standpoint, so you don't approach as an individual researcher, but you're representing an institution or you're representing a few institutions. So if you can, again, use your network and create consensus around a particular topic and write a policy brief with more than one institution having like multiple logos on there, the policymaker can see that it's obviously been signed off on by multiple scientific organizations. It must be an important issue and it must have robust scientific evidence behind it. If you're getting in touch with a policymaker as an individual scientist, that can be a lot harder because, again, they don't know who you are. And for good reason, they might be a bit more distrustful. However, I will say if you're able to meet someone at a policy event in person at some point in time, if you're able to form some sort of rapport with one individual, it doesn't have to be a decision maker, it can be an assistant of a decision maker, and you can build that trust with that one person, that will help give you legitimacy as a person. And so then when they do have a policy question, they might actually come to you. And you can, there's a lot of different ways you can do that. Maybe you want to invite this one person to an event that you're hosting or a webinar that you're hosting, and give them the opportunity to share. And then also it gives you an excuse to get to know them a bit better. That can be really useful. But ideally, when you're engaging with policy, you're doing it with a team. And so it's not just you as an individual.
Sure. So either way, it's about building a network, either through fellow organizations and researchers, or with people who are actually in that process itself and kind of focusing on building relationships. So another question is about, I got a couple of these actually, is about how to transition from an academic or research background into a role that is more the science policy interface. Do you have any advice about how to proceed with that? What options are out there, perhaps?
Absolutely. That's a really great question and one I'm hearing more and more. The good news is the science policy interface around the world, but particularly in Europe, is growing. There are more and more of these positions that are being created. There are more working groups that are sort of focusing on the science policy interface. A lot more institutions, scientific organizations are realizing that they have to recognize and reward the work that a lot of their researchers are already doing in terms of engaging and connecting with policy. So that is already happening in the background. At the moment, there still aren't enough of these positions, I would say, particularly the knowledge broker position where you're really working between the two communities. However, you might like to start, if you're already working in an institution, you might like to start raising the question about, hey, is this something that we as an institution value? How can we demonstrate that? Do we want to start hosting a webinar on it? Do we want to start creating a working group? This is a really easy sort of low barrier entry point to start getting your institute engaged in policy and saying, look, we do this amazing research that is relevant for policymaking. How can we as an institute actually make sure that policymakers see it? Let's create a working group on that, either internally or also get external people to join that working group. And it's not initially a paid position, but it might give you experience if you're in that working group that you've helped create, to understand how you can do that within your institution. And once your institution does start to value and start to recognize the importance of having this sort of interaction with policy, which again, more and more institutions are starting to do, they might actually create a paid position for it. And I think this is something we can all do within our own institutions to sort of encourage and legitimize these knowledge brokerage positions. Apart from that, though, I would say, again, attend policy events, network with people, because a lot of policy institutions and also NGOs, think tanks, really do value the work and expertise of scientists. And I know scientists who have actually transitioned all the way over and are now working in the commission or who are working in policy institutions. So there are a lot of different pathways that you can potentially take.
Sure. So again, it's about building networks, so identifying other people in positions you might like and seeing what their career pathway is. But also, as it's still quite a growing and nascent area, also kind of trying to create your own space as well. That's part of it. Yeah. So we have another question about interacting with processes, but it's more asking about how to do it in a global South perspective. We have quite a EU-centric focus here, being the EGU. But I do suspect some of the steps might be similar in terms of identifying processes and things? If you
I
have
would
any.
say the basic steps are similar. However, I know there are a lot of cultural differences. I do have a contact in India, and he does a very similar role to me, and obviously in Indian context. However, I can't tell you much about his work. However, I do know the position at least exists. However, there are some cultures, I know Japan, for example, is a lot more hierarchical. And so it is more difficult to cross the barriers in terms of like, oh, I'm a scientist, I'm going to go talk to a policymaker. Apparently, in Japan, so I've heard, it is a lot less common to do that. And so our sibling society, JPGU, they don't really have a policy program for that reason. But as challenging as it is, regardless of where you live, we still need scientists to do this work. So maybe it's something you can also help if you're living in a country where it is more hierarchical, or it's more the two sectors are more separated. You could maybe start those conversations about bringing them closer together, or if you're in the position to invite various people again to an event that you're hosting who are outside of academia, that's something you could also do.
Thanks, Chloe. So we'll be bringing this to a close very soon. Time for a couple more questions. One is about AI. Should you be using AI tools for policy briefs? If a quick answer about that, perhaps.
I would say I don't. I wouldn't trust them, especially not at this stage. I also think quite often humans at this point in time are better at being able to talk together and I actually identify where the issues are. ChatGPT can look through websites and whatever else and tell you what other websites say. But if you're the researcher who is the one who's creating the groundbreaking research, you're going to know more about that particular issue and why it is a problem in a legislative sense, hopefully. One thing you can do though, if you are wanting to use ChatGPT for some reason or Chat AI, you can, if you're doing stakeholder mapping, you can ask it which institutes are working on this issue, and it will give you a list. And I have tried doing this before. It won't give you a very good list, but it will it will give you some institutions that are working on something similar to that. And maybe that gives you inspiration to actually look at their websites and work out actually who is working on this. Another thing you could do is post your policy brief onto some sort of a Chat AI website and ask it, is this using jargon? Or what are the issues with this policy brief if you're reading it as a policymaker? Is this clear? Is this understandable? Which sentences don't make sense if you're reading this as someone who has no understanding of X, Y, and Z? And then you might actually get some feedback. If you don't have a real person to ask, you could get feedback from AI. I still think a human's better at doing that than AI would be though. So long story short, no. I'm not, however, saying that in the future it won't be helpful.
So AI might be useful as a tool for language support, for example,
Yeah.
and for perhaps identifying networks or infrastructure. But in the end, realize that you're the expert when you're reducing this complex information to something that's consumable. Like you're the one who's best at identifying what needs
I
to be
will also
solved.
say at this point, I've noticed it's very bad at summarizing. If you say summarize the key points in this and you give it some text, it won't pick out what I would identify as the most important points. So don't rely on it.
Perfect. So we're actually just out of time. So I want to thank you, all the attendees, for coming today. I hope it's been a super useful session. Also, thank you, Chloe, for delivering the presentation today. Yeah, keep in mind for some future policy events that are happening. I've put a link in the chat. That includes also the Hangout next month, on Monday, where you can perhaps meet other scientists and policymakers
Yes, please
interested
come
in this.
along. Yeah.
But yeah, for now, we'll end the Zoom. Thank you for coming.